Hi, guys. Welcome to Advocates Table, the podcast where I cross examine advocates on politics, law, and everything that's worth arguing about. Today, I'm incredibly excited to be interviewing Helena Kennedy. As a law student, this is genuinely a dream come true. Her books, Eve Was Framed and Miss Justice, are some of the most powerful things I've ever read. They've made me cry, fired me up, and made me even more passionate about fighting for justice. And on top of that, she's simply one of the most brilliant legal minds of our time. She's changed the landscape of the law in our country, especially for women and marginalized communities. And I'm so excited for our conversation today. So, Helena, I'd love to start by asking, what are you currently working on right now? And is there a case that's keeping you up at night?
Well, at the moment, my work now is although I was very much a domestic lawyer working in the criminal law field, and as you've mentioned, a lot of work on trying to make the law much more responsive to the experiences of women, because of course the law was devised and came from fundamental principles that women had no say in, and so often there were aspects of law that just didn't work for women, and expectations, which were really the sort of expectations what we might have about male behaviour. Anyway, we're getting to a different place, but it's been a slow process and we're not quite there yet. But that was my work domestically. And I also did a lot of high profile political cases alleging terrorism, espionage, all manner of things. I've always been interested in the sort of public interest end of law, political end of law, to make sure that people, even when they are not, we might not share their views, we have to make sure that people have fair trials. And the due process and fair trial is so fundamental to a democracy. So it's all about the rule of law, really. So in my sort of, as I became more experienced, I started being introduced to cases that were in the international domain. And I now, at the moment, you're asking, what am I doing now? I'm actually very involved now in war crimes. And I'm working for President Zelensky's office with a small team of his, in his immediate circle, with his uh, chef de cabinet, his basically his right hand man, a man called Andriy Yermak. And what we're really working on is the basically the abduction of huge numbers of children. We're not sure about the exact numbers, but thousands of children have been taken by the Russian troops into Russia and dispersed across Russia into foster homes, into some for small children, sometimes into adoption, and have disappeared into that great huge nation. And so that is a war crime. The forced removal of people and taking them elsewhere is a crime that is forbidden by the Geneva Conventions. And so we're working on that, because as there's more and more talk, with President Trump at the heart of it, wanting to have some sort of settlement of this, we have to make sure that in any peace negotiation that the children do not become a bargaining chip. We'll give you your children back, but only if you give us this territory, which would be such an abuse of human rights and the rights that are very well established in international conventions to protect children. I mean, Lalin, there's no shortage of law to try and make a special case for children. That when it comes to conflict, that we should be actually guarding the lives of those who've had no say in whether there should be wars or conflicts, and that they deserve our special protection. And that's been recognised for a long time. But we're seeing, unfortunately, we're seeing a neglect of those principles in the wars that are currently taking place. Whether it's in the Middle East, or whether it's in Sudan, or whether it's in the Congo. I mean, really terrible things happening to women and children, and the use of sexual assault as a weapon of war, and rape, and so on. I mean, these are areas that I'm now currently very involved with. But I'm doing a set of things. I mean, only yesterday I was involved with some work to do with a couple who are British citizens who sort of decided that before they got too old, they would have one great sort of traveling tour and adventure. And on the husband's motorbike, the two of them went off, knapsacks and things, across Turkey, and they were in Iran and looking at all the Iran is a beautiful, beautiful country, and they were seeing the sights and taking photographs and things, and they've been arrested and accused of espionage. Now, there's a history of Iran doing this, and it's basically to get leverage. They often want to negotiate something, and they use the arrest and detention, the unjust arrest and detention of people, in order to have some leverage with the West. And we've seen it with journalists, but we've seen it also. You'll remember Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe, the woman who was an Iranian originally, but married a British man, had a little baby, and she went out there with her baby to visit her parents, and she was arrested. 6 years it took us to get her out, and it took her husband having to go on a hunger strike and to really press our authorities into reaching. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a hoarse throat today, in reaching some sort of conclusion on that. So we know, I mean, one of the things that I feel that we have to be campaigning for in Britain is a much more proactive position from the British government in protecting people who've got British passports and are British citizens. We've got Jimmy Lai, and it's another campaign I'm involved in. Jimmy Lai was a media owner in Hong Kong, great pro-democracy activist, and he set up a newspaper. He was a very rich and successful businessman in the clothing industry. But he set up a newspaper and basically sold up his companies to create a media setup with a thing called Apple Daily, a pro-democracy newspaper, because he was worried after Britain left Hong Kong that unfortunately, the power of China would become greater and greater, and that democracy would disappear, despite the international treaty that it wouldn't. And basically, he's now in prison, has been for 4 years, and is on trial again against the national security law. They say breaching it because he's, a critic of what China has been seeking to do inside Hong Kong. And so he's a British citizen, and he's now 76, and he's being held in solitary confinement and is becoming unwell. It's just, we've got to be much more active in saying, give us back our citizens, and Jimmy Lai should be allowed to, should be freed, and we should be absolutely vehement as a government that our citizens have to be protected when they're traveling abroad or living abroad or whatever. But these things are happening, and that's what I'm working on, basically, around international law, international rights.
That's amazing, Helena. Yeah, your work on arbitrary detention is absolutely incredible. And it's so shocking that these British citizens have been held there for so long and nothing's happened. So, what do you think the solution is to that? Is it an issue of the Foreign Office or the current PM of the time? What should we be doing to push it forward?
The closer you get to this, it's a very interesting, Lalin, because I was a practitioner lawyer until I eventually, in my late 40s, I was asked to come into the House of Lords by the Blair government, and it is a huge privilege to be sitting in our Parliament, and we're not there because we stood for election and went through all the hardship that's involved in that. And I would never have done that. I was never interested in being an elected politician. But when I was asked to go into the House of Lords, it was because we were going through a big period of reform, and the government had committed to introducing the European Convention on Human Rights into British law, and we were involved in a whole set of constitutional changes that I thought it was time to introduce, Freedom of Information Act and so on, and so that was why I had at that time been campaigning strongly for those things, and so I was asked to go into the House of Lords, and it was a great opportunity and has been wonderful and a privilege. But which isn't to say that I don't think it needs to be reformed. However, I do think that what it has meant for me is that I always say I'm a parliamentarian and not a politician. But when you're in there, you see up close, the interconnection between law and politics, and you do see that sometimes for governments it's hard. Here we are, we're in an economic crisis in Britain, and there's a desperate attempt to have much better trading relationships with countries all around the world. That we also want investment. We want outside countries to invest with us. And sometimes the people that we're wanting to invest are not great regarders of human rights or the rule of law, and so there's all this tiptoeing around to not offend people or to be too critical. And so, I mean, that's the problem for government. I'm not restrained in that way because I'm a lawyer. I can be much more open about my interpretation of law, how I see the law, and the ways in which I think law is being abused. And what I feel just now is that our world is in a bloody awful place because, just look at the number of conflicts that there are and how, you know, authoritarian leaders, whether we're talking about Putin or whether we're talking, they have total disregard for law, and law, basically, law is there to serve their purposes. They will use law when they want people arrested, and they will invoke law for that, but they will not see themselves constrained by law. And that's one of the problems. And unfortunately, it's not just totalitarian leaders, Xi in China and Putin in Russia, or the Ayatollah in Iran. We're actually seeing it spreading into places that we felt were committed to democracy, a sort of disregard for aspects of law and particularly international law, and denigrating the international courts. I mean, just in the same way, I mean, here you are, you're becoming a lawyer, and all your colleagues are becoming lawyers, and which is wonderful. But one of the things that we believe as lawyers is that there is a place for law. I mean, all of our human relationships almost are now, in some ways, affected by legal constraints. That when it comes to marriage and divorce and the responsibility for our children, and when it comes to employment and the protections that there are inside employment, and then there's the law relating to landlords and tenants and the responsibilities that landlords might have to the tenants about keeping the property in good order and all of that sort of thing. So law is almost in every part of our lives, and it's certainly in our lives when it comes to commercial matters and has been for centuries. But what we have to recognize is that our relationships with other countries also have to be regulated by law. I mean, law is the great regulator, and after the Second World War, the great thing was that, there was a coming together of the world to say there are some things about which we must have consensus. One of them is that, you protect citizens, and the folk who weren't the decision makers. Why should they be decimated? And the many things that came out of the Second World War, the horror of the Holocaust leading to protections for human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I always say that one of the places where I'd have wanted to be at the dinner table was Eleanor Roosevelt, getting all the lawyers and judges and jurists around her table in Washington Square, because her husband by then, who'd been the president, was dead. And she just wanted to have a legacy that was about learning from that war, that horrible world war. And so her thing was, can we not create world law? And of course the answer to that was no, because law comes out of different nations' experiences and traditions and all of that, and we have to respect that. But that there could be do we share values? Are there values that we share that should be informing those legal systems? And that was what the Universal Declaration was about having a template of values that, that we know that the right to life should be protected, except in exceptional circumstances. We know what torture does to people, not just the people who suffer the infliction of torture and persecution, but the people who are doing it are dehumanized in the process too. And we know that most of us, the world is full of people. Our common humanity means that we all want mostly the same things. We want to love and be loved. We want to feel security. We want to protect our children. We want, the things that people want, and we also know what pain is like and suffering. And so I do think that creating that set of values was an important step, which then led to, the creation of the European Convention on Human Rights and conventions on rights that exist around the world. But they're unraveling. And they're unraveling because I think the politics of the world has been to retreat into nationalisms, and the nationalisms are often led by powerful men, usually, who are usually highly narcissistic and certainly do not want to be constrained by law themselves.
Do you think international institutions are doing enough to enforce these universal human rights?
It's very difficult. I mean, the notion was that when they created the Security Council at the UN after the Second World War, it was the sort of main nations. I mean, people would have said it was, of course, sort of the victors came together. It was, Russia, and then China was included because it was so enormous, and the UK and France and the United States of America. But one of the things about that is, of course, things change, and you now have both China um, and Russia have been able to veto things because they thought, well, if we pass that, they'll be turning on us next. So with the Security Council's power and its power to veto has been a serious problem. And so there needs to be reforming of those great institutions. But you're not going to, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And certainly this is not a great moment for doing it because in many ways, we now have the United States joining in this clamour for saying they're too interventionist and why should they be telling us what to do, that sort of thing. Um, you know, the nature of law is that what you learn as a practitioner is that law can be used for good ends, but also for bad ends, and you see that as a practitioner. I've done cases of miscarriages of justice and the pain that's inflicted on people when they experience injustice. I mean, look at the post office scandal just now in Britain, where all those people and people convicted and indeed spending time in prison and becoming pariahs in their communities because people thought they were fraudsters and it turned out that it was technology that failed, and it's a lesson to us at this time in our progress as human beings that we're handing over an awful lot to the tech bros, to the big technical companies who are changing our relationships using technology, and not always in ways that are good.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you more about that. With the rise of technology, things like sexual deepfakes, how can we use the law to combat against this?
Well, at some point, you really must interview Charlotte Owen, who's a young conservative peer, and she has been very big on this, and I've supported her in it, and I'm very fond of her. She's she's not of the same political persuasion as me, but she is. I mean, I'm a sort of centre left person, and she's I suppose, a centre right person. But there's overlap. Often on things, particularly, you'll get women around the house. We've just had it just now in the House of Lords, where the non-disclosure agreement issue became an issue for all women on all benches, saying we cannot have women being coerced into signing non-disclosure agreements, and then they sign away their right to actually ever speak about horrible things that have happened to them. And it's wrong for non-disclosure agreements in the world of employment to be used in that way. I mean, there's a good reason for having non-disclosure agreement because, why should somebody take the client list and go off to a new life and steal all the, if you like, the kind of copyright and the intellectual property of a company that they've worked for. And so it's right that companies should be able to protect their, if you like, their commercial secrets. But I do think that using it to silence women has been one of the horror stories. Women across the House came together, and the government is now introducing a sort of ban on that use of non-disclosure agreements, which is great. And so, but Charlotte Owen on the business of fakes, she's been raising this. She's really been quite insistent and quite dogged on it. And it's about the fact that it's so easy now to basically superimpose, women's faces onto pornographic movies and so on. And we've seen it used in the most horrifying ways. I mean, one of the journalists, a woman journalist from Iran, who was working, in fact, for the BBC, a thing like that was circulated to her children's school, to her daughter's school, of her in a pornographic film. And it wasn't true, but it was to basically reduce her in the eyes of her child, but all the people who are children and a child is not a tiny child. She was an adolescent girl, 14 of it. And it was to, to say this is your mother, that she's a whore and a porn star. I mean, awful. And those things are being done to humiliate, and it's happening to ordinary women. You don't have to be famous for it to happen, although it has happened to many famous women. So, I mean, something has to be done about all of that.
Yeah, I think the law has to evolve quickly to kind of legislate on that as well, because the technology is advancing so rapidly, it's absolutely terrifying.
The problem with law is that it almost invariably is trailing behind those kinds of shifts and changes. But the great thing is that we're much more alert to these things now, and women are sort of vigilant in a way that perhaps we accepted a status quo in the past that was ridiculous.
But Helena, your work on international law is absolutely incredible, and your leadership on evacuating Afghan women was extraordinary. And I wanted to ask, how close are we to codifying gender apartheid in international law?
Well, it's interesting you should raise that, because yesterday I was in the house, and I had gone in specially because at the moment I'm recovering from a knee operation, as you know, and but I dragged myself in because it was a meeting of about women and security and international affairs, and it was there were wonderful women from the Afghan community there, women who had been members of parliament, women who had um, played important roles there. And they're heartbroken at what they're seeing happening to their sisters and their relatives and to their nieces and the children, girl children back, and to the boys, because what they say is the boys are now being educated in a way that is excluding of women and being filled with a kind of distorted notion of Islam that places women in a much in a really reduced place in society. Now, I mean, there's a certain amount of controversy around, is gender apartheid an appropriate language for describing what's happening? And I, I want people to know that the whole notion is not some Western thing, or women in exile have come up with this notion. I first heard it coming from women inside Afghanistan, saying that what was happening to them was apartheid, and that they were being treated in the way that people of color in South Africa were being treated as second-class citizens, that they don't have full participation as people living in a nation, that they don't have freedom of association, freedom of participation, freedom of movement, that they are restricted in the education that's available to them. They can't hold down jobs that are in the public domain. They can't be in any of the governing roles or in the media, all of that. And that is a denial of your humanity. And so now there is the crime of gender persecution, and to persecute, and some women are. I mean, if they've demonstrated and things, have been taken into custody. They are subjected to what could only be described as torture and inhumane treatment, and sexual abuse at times. And I know and have spoken to women who've experienced those things. So yes, crimes are being committed, but gender apartheid is something much more systemic. It's about in the very, if you like, the breathing apparatus of a nation is this idea that women are not to be participants, are not full participants. And of course, it's an infantilizing thing, but it's also a subjugation. And so, I mean, one of the things that shocks me is that the world is not outraged and expressing more outrage about all this. And one of the things that I feel strongly is that if there's any meetings with the Taliban or anything about getting humanitarian aid into Afghanistan, because we don't want people to suffer and starve, men and women and children and so on, and they are going through a hard time. But women should be in every delegation, the UN. Every time any nation sends people, they have to have women included and say we're sending, a number of the people will be female, and insist upon it, and not conform to what they say um, are their requirements. And I do think that gender apartheid describes, in a way, what's happening to the women in a way that nothing else does was back in the 50s. When apartheid was introduced in South Africa, there was a convention created. The world came together and said this is unacceptable, and an apartheid convention was created. But all the language, if you read it, is very much pertaining to race. And so many people say, you know, you're distorting it because this is about racism. But in fact, you look at the concepts and so on, and you see that a read across can very easily take it into what is being experienced by women in Afghanistan and indeed in Iran. There are women movements in Iran who describe themselves as fighting gender apartheid. So it's something we've taken up. We held an inquiry into in Parliament, which my Institute of Human Rights at the International Bar Association sort of laid on. And we've got a lot of evidence from women in Afghanistan and in exile about what was happening. And we did a report on Afghanistan and Iran. And it's hard to remember that, you know, not that long ago, when I was a young woman, and we started running around in sort of short skirts and long boots, and we were part of that sort of 70s generation. Young women in Afghanistan were running around in the same way.
Yeah.
And we found photographs of young women looking very similar to how I looked when I was a student. And and then, of course, you know, there have been different phases in and events in Afghanistan. You know, the invasion by the Russians, the business of then the Taliban and the Mujahideen coming, warlords taking control, and then what happened to women as a consequence of that kind of fundamentalism. Any kind of fundamentalism, whether it's and deep orthodoxy, whether it's in religion, any religions, any of them, the most restrictive ends of them almost invariably go after women and women's rights. And in the same way, we have it with extremist politics, you know, politics which are so fundamentalist that they don't allow for any, you know, any aberration at all. And almost invariably, women suffer the consequences of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's terrifying that there used to be Afghan female judges as well before it completely turned around. And I think we're seeing that across the world, maybe in the US and other places.
Oh, that's been. I mean, do you know that I've just, thank God, I've just managed to get 3 Afghan women judges and their families visas to come to the United Kingdom from Pakistan. They had been given visas by the United States of America. You see, what happened was that I was involved, as you know, in evacuating. Initially, it was we got out 102 women judges and their families. It was 508 altogether with their children and their husbands. And we got them out, and then we had to disperse them. I mean, that was bad enough, getting them out and chartering aeroplanes and so on. And I didn't sleep for, you know, 2 months. But then it was getting the world to open its arms and to provide visas to people. That was a shock to me, that there wasn't much more embracing of these brave women whose lives were put in jeopardy, and they certainly were. Once we'd got those out, then of course the Taliban put a block on any flights and stuff, so it was impossible then. And what we had to say to any judges left behind was, try to get yourself to Pakistan. There you can apply to the United Nations Refugee Council to be recognised as a refugee, and then we'll try and get you into places. Now, the 3 women judges that I've just got visas for to come to Britain, as the door here in Britain has closed, they had visas to go to America, and I'm afraid they were cancelled by the new administration. And they were in terror because Pakistan has decided that they're going to send back any people who are undocumented, who are Afghanis. And so they were waiting for the knock on the door to send them back, and they were in terror. And I'm glad to say that Britain, our current government, agreed to take them because they were in such an extreme position. But it was hard work, I have to tell you. And there are still women that you know are really fearful of putting their foot out of the door. And some of them are in Pakistan, but some of them are still there in Afghanistan.
How do we enforce accountability on these regimes that systematically oppress women? Because as you said, it's insane that there's not an uproar globally about what's currently going on.
I mean, I do think there is. I think that we I mean, I was someone who wanted us to remain in the European Union, and so I'm not going to pretend that I don't still yearn for that close association. And it wasn't a perfect set of arrangements, but being close to your nearest neighbours is important, and you can argue about things and so on. However, I think that they are the best people to trade with and so forth. But also, what's become clear in relation to Ukraine is that the best way of dealing with the Russian sort of flexing of its muscles, its expansionism, its aggressive stance in relation to being so anti the European Union. And it uses very, very destructive means to do it. I mean, let's be clear. A lot of the interference with elections, interference with the functioning of our democracy, cyber attacks, poisoning attacks of actual individuals, happening. I mean, something like 40 odd people have been murdered in Britain over the recent years by the Russian regime, and so we mustn't underestimate the threat that comes from there. And so I do think that one of the ways that we have to do it is that we have to first of all create coalitions of nations that do want to protect democracy in our world and that do care about the rule of law, and we have to be bold enough to call out what's happening. Now, that was one of the functions of NATO, was that, all for one and one for all, like the Three Musketeers, we're all going to stand together. And unfortunately, the United States is becoming reluctant to take that stance. It doesn't feel that sense of being part of something bigger. It may be that as the United States experiences the full problem of what Russia stands for, they may actually reevaluate that, and I hope they do. I do think that the way to deal with this is to be saying, we can't trade with you. If you're doing these things, no trading. We have to use sanctions in a serious way, and we also have to use the resources that come from sanctions to help restore nations that have been attacked, like Ukraine. I mean, for example, there are huge sums of money in banks, which are state funds. Russia's own monies are in because it was part of the Council of Europe. They've got a whole lot of their own money in the European Bank, which is based in Brussels. I mean, we're talking about billions. And those assets are currently frozen. The Bank of England has assets. The Federal Bank in the United States of America has some, nothing like as much as the European Bank. Japan's got a whole set of Russia's money, and that those monies, really, we have to find a way of accessing those money. At the moment, we're using the interest from the seized assets. Countries have agreed to have the assets used, for example, to help pay for some of the arming of the Ukrainians, so that they can purchase weaponry. But we should be able to access the actual money. Now, let me explain that the reason why most of our countries across Europe and the United States and so on, we have state immunity laws, which are to protect nations' funds on the basis that seizing funds was something that the West was always afraid that if communism somehow swept through Europe, that they would seize all the assets that there were in banks. And so this notion of law that says you can't do that there's state immunity, that there's a protection, a special sort of iron wall protection for those sort of monies. So drafting the kind of law that would make it very, very specifically applicable to Russia and its behavior towards Ukraine would be quite tricky. You can understand that, of course, America and Britain are rather worried that if they do this, Iraq might decide, well, we would like compensation and reparations for what happened when there was the Iraq war. And so, there are those issues, which is when can it bounce back against us, for example? And so those are things that operate as inhibitors on governments. But I do think that you have to find ways of making people pay when they are breaking the law, and one of them is by using those kind of assets. What people say is, well, then they'll stop banking with Western countries. They'll create their own sort of collaborations to protect their monies. They'll create their own banking systems that are for other nations. All of that. So there are problems. about sanctioning, but I do think that reparations, should be going to Ukraine in order to help them to rebuild. Now, look at the business of what's happening just now in the Middle East. I mean, I understand entirely the whole business of Israel, the outrage of what happened on the 7th of October. I mean, it was horrifying, and serious and grievous atrocity crimes were committed, and the world's jaw fell, and we wept. We wept with the people of Israel at what they experienced. Now, then we've seen a sort of, if you like, Israel saying we have to defend ourselves. Every nation is entitled to defend itself, but a point comes where you have to say what is proportionate. When does it reach a point? Now, what I'm concerned about just now is this idea which is catching hold, which is that the safest thing to do for Israel is to just get rid of all the Palestinians, shunt them out, send them off to somewhere else. And they're not saying that send them off to America or to, nice Western nations. No, no, no. We'll push them off into the deserts. We'll push them off into bits of Egypt which are underpopulated. We'll try and get Jordan to take more. And how will that be done? By putting pressure on those nations which have considerable problems of their own, pushing people into those places by saying to them, you will not get assistance on arming yourselves in case of your needs. You will not be able to do business with us, to trade with us. So the threats that are being made to Egypt and Jordan to make them take in this, discarded set of people. I mean, the world should be shocked at the idea that you can do that to a whole people, that you just throw them off the land. That I mean, I was listening to the radio to a very interesting program about the DNA of Palestinians today, certainly particularly Christian Palestinians, dates all the way back and coincides with Bronze Age bodies that have been found in the testing of DNA of bodies that existed in that part of the world in the Bronze Age. You know, so we're not talking about, it's as if there's a competition about who lived there however many thousand years ago. That it's been claimed that, there's a biblical claim for Israel. People have to, in the modern world, say we have to be able to live side by side in accordance with the law, and we have to do so in a way to secure peace and justice. And I mean, call me Pollyanna, but I believe it's the only answer, is to do it in that way. And you don't deny the existence of a people and then just seek to discard them or pressurize them to make choices that in the ordinary way they would never make.
You spoke with Lady Hale on rule of law in terms of Israel and Palestine, and it was absolutely fascinating what you two were saying about it. And I completely agree that. But I'm wondering what the best solution is then, because if international institutions aren't able to stop this from happening, then what should we be doing?
Well, I mean, the awful thing is that we're going to have to resist efforts that I think are currently taking place, which I think are malign, to try and destroy the courts, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They only came into being after great struggle and after horrible things happening. And the idea was that the only way that you can secure justice, which is the route towards peace, is by having accountability, and that those who do, transgress and ignore the law and commit crimes have to be dealt with. Um, and of course, people. I know people in the House of Lords who want to see the end of the International Criminal Court. They want to see it disbanded.
What's
No,
their reason for that?
well, because they think it's politicized, and they think it's being used to go after particular people. I mean, there are people who will say, why is there so much attention being placed on Israel and not on China? Well, I mean, I spend a lot of time on China as well, let me tell you, and I have actually been sanctioned by the Chinese for my criticisms of them. So no holidays for me in Hong Kong or in China or on the Yangtze or anything. So all I can say is that one of the things is that there's always been a sort of romance with the idea of trying of the people who settled in Israel being survivors of a terrible genocide themselves. And so there's always been a sort of attachment to the pain and therefore wanting their security, but also wanting them to live up to all the things that we've invested in our idea of what Jewishness means. I'm not Jewish myself, but most of my mentors as lawyers were Jewish lawyers, mainly men, of course, given my generation, but wonderful. My pupil master was Jewish. I did a period in the United States with a law firm, and the senior partner who became my great mentor all my sort of early professional life was a great Jewish lawyer, and so many of the people who've influenced me from different parts of the world have been steeped in that Talmudic idea of what justice means. And so I've always identified with that and sort of drawn inspiration from it. And I feel that what's happening just now is not part of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think your work in domestic law is also absolutely incredible. You've done so much to combat misogyny in law in Scotland, for example. And I remember reading about your Misogyny Act in Scotland, and I think they ended up backing away from it. I
Yeah.
want to know, why did that happen? And
The whole thing is that in our contemporary world, this business has developed about wokeness. That everybody has sort of gone too mad on being politically correct and whatever. And what is wokeness? If you examine it closely, what is not liked is the work that's being done to try and include people from minorities, to be more embracing of womanhood, and that women should be treated as equals. It's about trying to iron out the divisions that there are in society. So I think that most of the stuff that is criticised as being woke is actually embedded in very decent, good aspirations to create a society that is not treating as other and as less certain people, because of disabilities or because of their sexuality or because they are trans or whatever. And I'm afraid that the Scottish thing became very embroiled and rather ugly around all of that. And I always go back to the thing, which is that I mean, I'm a feminist. Let me be very clear. I also have quite strong class politics. I want a much more even kind of society where people are not going to be limited because they don't have the funding to acquire a good education and so on. I think we have responsibilities to each other. But it's all based in my worldview is based in the notion of our common humanity, and I think that's your starting point, and that's how you stop societies becoming divided. And the ugliness of this whole accuse everybody of wokeness, or accuse anybody who criticises the Israeli government of being anti-Semitic, it's just wrong. Because I spend a lot of time criticising my own government, and I criticise governments around the world, and it's a distinction between the government and the people of nations. I have absolutely nothing but respect and admiration for so many of the Chinese people I've ever met and known, and I have no horror of people who are Chinese, but I am pretty horrified by what's done by their government.
Mhm. And you've done amazing work on domestic violence in UK law as well. And I wanted to ask, what would meaningful police reform look like?
Well, most of this stuff at the end is about trying to move people to accepting that, I mean, when I started, it's just, Lalin, when I look back on it, I used to go to court when I was a young barrister in my 20s. And the magistrates would say, go outside and kiss and make up. I mean, there's six of one and half a dozen of the other. I'm sure she nagged you to death. Just, and it was always this idea that women nagged men couldn't take it anymore, gave them a good old walloping, and there were no consequences because it was seen as being even Stevens, honestly. And it was shocking. Uh, and and I knew about that because as a child, I always remember that my mother was a great sort of person in the community, and I particularly remember as a child, I was one of those kids that sat in the corner with a book, but I was watching and listening, and and um, and I do remember that somebody who lived in the tenement building that we lived in came to my mother, and she had a black. My mother, I think, had seen her in the close and saw that her face was all bruised and she had black eyes. And my mother brought her in, and she had a small baby, and we knew I could sense my mother seemed to know that she was being battered, and my mother gave her the money to go and return to her own family.
So
I mean, we had nothing, but I mean, and I remember my mother doing that, and I remember hearing my mother speaking to my aunt and saying this girl was, just being beaten to a pulp by her uh, husband, and and uh, and had you know, no recourse, had no funding, and money was he didn't give her any money for even for housekeeping or anything. And so my mother scrabbled together stuff in her purse. And my mother used to hide money in places for emergencies, and so and gave her the money so that she could return to England to her own family. So I'd seen that happening, and the horror my mother had, and my father. I didn't grow up with domestic violence, but I knew about it even when I was a child.
I think one thing that I find so distressing is that police often don't believe accounts of women. And I think one of the things I read in your book that I found absolutely fascinating was the idea of badgered woman syndrome, that the law doesn't recognize that women actually react differently to situations, and that's why offenses should be different.
Absolutely, and the other thing is that um, when I started doing and trying to fight the domestic violence cases in a different way, and to get the information before a jury and before a judge as to how domestic violence would take a toll. They would say things like, why didn't she, if this was going on, any reasonable, if somebody was hitting you, you would, why didn't she go to the police? Why didn't she get help? Why didn't she do this? And it's of course not understanding the shame that women are made to feel, that somehow it must be their fault. Why is he doing this to me? I don't want our neighbours, and I don't want my family to know that he does this to me, because and I don't want to be told to leave him because he's the father of my children, and how will I survive? Um, and all of those things, and women in tight communities, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Catholic communities in Glasgow or Jewish communities in North London or whatever, but if you're part of a tight community, the community also sort of becomes a sort of source of pressure to not expose dirty linen in a public way, because they think it will kick back on the community as a whole. That's the sort of behaviour that you get from these Irish Catholics, or that's the sort of behaviour you get from these um, particular people. So it was so interesting, the myths that exist around this, that women bring it on their own heads, that women instigate it, that women exaggerate, that women lie. I mean, all those things were so present in the courts when I started, and we had to keep sort of challenging it. And the great thing is that now, your generation, it's sort of, it's in the textbooks, it's understood, it's in your law lectures, the ways in which that those things have been challenged, the stereotyping of women and what is acceptable women behavior. I mean, I remember, I mean, this is to my shame, I'm going to tell you, is that, I mean, I remember in the early days saying to my clients, oh, don't wear that Lurex jumper, or because if a woman looked too sexy or looked too, I mean, that male judges would be assessing, is this woman a decent woman? Is she a good woman? Is she a good mother? And you would work your socks off to try and make sure that she fulfilled those ridiculous expectations. And so and so you would try and, to advise your client that assumptions will be made if you appear in a particular way.
I think that still happens today. I did work experience with a criminal barrister on a rape case, and some of the evidence they were pulling up was like selfies of the women to use as evidence in court, or like talking. And I just thought I was horrified during this work experience that this was going on still today.
And the idea is that they know that if you produce photographs of a woman sort of looking as if she's drunk and with a cocktail in her hand at some party with her girlfriends, or that, she's seen with her arm around some guy, that she's obviously a slut and a sloven and easily available and the sort of, whore that would make things up. I mean, those things live still in the hearts of people. And misogyny, it's not just men who experience it. I mean, women themselves will say things about other women, which is,
Yeah.
oh, she's obviously a slut and she's obviously a tramp, that kind of thing. I mean, I know that the language is different nowadays. I'm probably using very old-fashioned language, but I mean, that whole thing is that judgments are made about women on all kinds of bases that can work against them, and sometimes it's women can be the worst enemies of their own gender, of their own sex.
But do you think the law still fails in this area, like the reasonable person standard, for instance? Do you think the law adequately understands women's experiences today, or is it still an issue?
Well, I mean, we listen. I mean, I'm no longer doing sort of the daily round of crime in the Old Bailey and in the way that I used to. So I think one of the things is that I think we still have a populace, and I think that social media has not helped with this, which shares a lot of kind of attitudes that we haven't expunged, attitudes towards women. And so I think there are still those sort of problems. I still am a big believer in the jury system because I think it is better to get people in. And I think that having, women on juries to say, "Oh, come on, why should just because she kissed him doesn't mean to say that he was entitled to have sex with her, and certainly not to have anal sex with her." I mean, it's this business which is that somehow pornography has visited on the minds of men, that you only have to sort of smile at them, and that the whole range of sexual possibilities flashes before them. And I mean, I've always said, if I talk about this publicly, I say you should be saying to people, if you're involved in sexual things, is this okay with you? Are you how and be checking in with people, not just assuming that you can roll folk over and then penetrate any orifice that you can find. Uh, it's just awful.
I know it's absolutely terrible. I wanted to know if you could introduce any law right now, what would it be?
I suppose I'm so preoccupied with war crimes at the moment. I really the reparations thing, of trying to get accessing large amounts of money that could help, rebuild, help with the training of people for the trauma that people experience in war. You need to have counselors and therapists and people who can work with the people who've suffered. I mean, I really think it's shocking that 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 we can't more readily access those monies. But anyway, so that I would like to do. But there are other things I care about. I mean, for example, I care about the women. I mean, there's a whole thing about domestic workers who come to this country, and often I have to say to work for privileged families, and they hand over their passport, and they're paid a pittance, and sometimes the money is paid directly to their family back in Bangladesh or somewhere, or the Philippines, which is a tiny amount, and they're not treated and covered by employment expectations that we have here. And they should be able to shift their employment. We don't allow people who come in with an overseas family. We don't allow them to be able to leave that family and get a different job. Um, and I just think that we should be looking at the protections of people who end up suffering because of the kind of employment they're in, particularly domestic things. When I did an inquiry into human trafficking in Scotland, and it was for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, because there were very few prosecutions in Scotland, or I don't think there'd been any at that point. And what we discovered was that I mean, it was basically just about a lack of awareness amongst the police. They'd raid places for drugs, and there'd be women there, and it wouldn't occur to them that they were actually enslaved and providing sex, and and that people were making money out of them as well. So that the trafficking wasn't just in drugs; it was in people, it was in arms, and all kinds of things. But one of the shocking things that we discovered was domestic servitude in Scotland. But of course, it's happening in London too, and it's happening in different places. And it's people, treating as people who are working for them in the domestic setting, treating them in the most appalling ways, where they sleep on a mat in the kitchen and stuff like that, in quite grand houses. And they're expected to be available from the crack of dawn in the morning until last thing at night, when the husband who owns a chain of restaurants gets home and expects to have tea made for him, and other expectations too, unfortunately.
Yeah. I don't think that's talked about enough in the news as well, that idea of domestic servitude. But before we round the session up, I wanted to ask, you've been the voice for some of the most voiceless people in the most dangerous parts of the world, and I wanted to know what keeps you going.
Oh, listen, I've just got a new grandbaby. I've got a great family, and by that I mean I'm married to a wonderful man, who's been always been very, very supportive to me, and I'm lucky. I feel lucky that I'm with him, and I've got great kids. I've got two boys and a girl, and they're all adults now, and I've got a whole set of grandchildren, and that's a joy. And I also love the theatre. I like I like music. You take comfort in those things. And my friendships. I've got wonderful women friends. I mean, and men friends. I really cherish my friendships, and they bring great joy to me and comfort to me. So those are the things that keep you going. And you also just have to keep optimistic. I mean, I do still believe that most folk are good folk, and we just have to always speak to the better angels of people.
Helena, is there a case or client that's changed you forever?
Oh, I, I, doing miscarriage of justice cases is one of the most painful things, because people always say to you, "How do you feel if you're representing somebody that you know in your heart is guilty?" And I say, I will say, well, your professionalism takes control, and you say, people have to be properly represented in the way that they want. I mean, without becoming a slave to their madnesses. But I mean, but you represent someone using law in a proper way, to give them a good defence in accordance with law, as I say. But, but the worst thing of all is not representing somebody you think probably is guilty. The worst thing of all is representing somebody where you think, this person really is innocent. And the weight of that on your shoulders is far, far greater. Where you think, oh my God, if I don't do my best job here, this person could go to jail for a very, very long time. And somehow in your gut, you know that they didn't do it. And I've had that experience a number of times. And those cases remain with you, of the weight of it. And I remember I once represented a woman called Mary Druhan, and she was convicted of murder, and she spent 11 years in prison. And then there was a great television series, which used to look at miscarriages of justice. Doesn't exist anymore. No money to spend on those kind of investigations and getting good experts to look at the scientific evidence and so on. And the allegation was that she had set fire to a place in which people had ended up dead. And we eventually got the evidence together to show that she couldn't have done it, and that in fact the cause of the death was not about someone setting a fire, but about accelerants being present in this sort of down and out place where people lived. And but Mary Druin, by the time I came to act for her, 11 years in jail, she'd become a child. She came into the room and she asked permission to sit down. And it was like being at a sort of very proper convent school. She deferred to everybody, and she had become infantilized. And it was awful to see. Um, and it was so sad. And I remember um, I won the case in the Court of Appeal, and I left, and her sister um, came to the court and was there then, and she was given a black plastic carrier bag because her clothes had been brought by the prison van for her hearing. And I remember that as we stepped out onto the Strand from the Royal Courts of Justice, and that the noise of the traffic frightened her, and she was frightened about crossing the road. And I thought she was going to have such trouble in embracing the world as someone who had acquired her freedom. She's really lost too much for ever to be put right again. So those things, and we see it with miscarriages of justice still, that the toll that it takes on people's lives is terrible.
Yeah, that is so, so sad. If you could speak to your younger self on your first day of court, what would you tell her?
Well, I mean, I was an innocent abroad when I think about it. The first court case I did, my client went to jail. And, and I cried on my way back to chambers. And it was partly because I, the case had obviously been ill prepared, or at least, I mean, I don't know how it had happened, but when I got to the court, the magistrate's court, which was in Tottenham, she had a suspended sentence for shoplifting. And I was, you see, that wasn't included in the papers that I was given, which was just, very basic stuff to say this woman has been caught shoplifting, and so on. And she was a mother with small children, absent partner. He'd pissed off with somebody. And so she was on her own and she'd stolen things, but it wasn't her first time. She was obviously making a regular habit of stealing. And when somebody has a suspended sentence like that, it's very hard for the court not to feel, well, you breached your suspended sentence, and they passed the sentence on her that she had to go to prison. And I remember going down to the cells and her saying, please, can you phone my friend and get her to take the children, because if they'll take them into care and I'll have difficulty getting them back. And the consequences of a poor woman, I mean, she was, an impoverished woman, a woman who had very little, who was a shoplifter, and that can be absolutely a public nuisance and so forth. But her children were going to end up in care, and the cost of all of that. She would lose her council flat, and she was begging me to make phone calls to people, which I then in turn tried to do. But and the friend saying, "Oh, I haven't got any money to be able to look after her children. How can I, and this the business of poverty leading to people being dealt with in ways that are really not addressing the underlying problems." So I would teach myself that the way in which you do justice is by really understanding um, the world beyond the courtroom door. You have to have really good knowledge about what's happening in society. Why are people going in these? What's going on? If I'd been able to say to the court, look, of course you've done this, but think of the cost of taking our children into care. But I wasn't sophisticated enough at that point. But I made sure that I did my homework and I got, to really understand the social circumstances. You know, social justice is as important as formal justice, and so much of crime ends up coming out of social injustice.
Yeah, I think it's devastating how many women are put into prison for petty crimes. I think there's a statistic where the majority of women are in prison for shoplifting due to poverty or other reasons to help their kids. And recently on the news, there's been this thing where they're releasing people convicted of rape from prisons to free up space in it. And I think it's awful that they haven't turned to people in need the most, those who are pregnant, for instance, as well.
I mean, we really have to look again at the number of women who are in prison for offences where you really should be doing something underneath, looking at the whole situation, preparing women, helping women with dependency on drugs and drink, and why is that? And it's almost invariably because they too have come from very damaged homes where they've been abused and battered and sexually abused as children and all manner of things, and then feel worthless, and so they continue to have relationships with abusive partners. So, it's about getting underneath all of that. And you really have to have courts that can, and you need to have, unfortunately, a resource to do that sort of work. And just now we've been driven to a situation where there's very little resource for those sort of public efforts. I'm going to have to say goodbye to everybody because
Yeah,
I've got to uh, uh, do some work on something that I'd committed to before. But it's really been great having this conversation, Lalin. I'm sorry that I've sort of gone at it like a train in a tunnel, but I just
no,
wanted to cover a certain amount of ground that I think, as lawyers, it doesn't matter what area of law you go into, and I say this to commercial lawyers too, you know, it's about retaining a set of values which will inform what you do, and and not become simply a cipher who does whatever if whatever the corporation expects of you. That somehow or other, we have to keep hold of what makes us feel decent as human beings. And so I say that we're all human rights lawyers in the end, wherever we're working, whatever sphere of law, we have to bring those values to what we do.
that's
Okay.
amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been incredible and so insightful. And I'm so grateful that I got the chance to speak to you and interview you.
Well, listen, I look forward to you becoming a very successful lawyer,
Thank
Lalin
you, Helena.
Osman. And good luck to everybody who's listening who's planning a career in the law, because we need good people in the law.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Helena.